After training consistently for over 20 years, coaching others for over 10, and experimenting with virtually every training and diet method under the sun with the goal to build muscle, I can tell you that trends come and go. New methods will gain popularity for a while, and even highly sought after experts will promote new ways to do things for a while, but after a certain period of time, they all come back to the things that work. The time-tested principles that have been around since the beginning. And while I've personally picked up tons of useful things through experimentation, and some of these newer ideas have even influenced my training in a positive way, it's still always a few basic principles that outperform everything else. And if you truly want to maximize your physique, you should not skip on these principles. And these principles should absolutely be the base of anyone's training plan. Today, I'm going to share my top 10 mass gain training tips with you, in no particular order, starting with number 1. Train a muscle group roughly 1 to 2 times per week. This is one of the most universal training principles for just about anyone looking to build muscle mass. We're talking from Mr. Olympia competitors to average gym goers. Your training should fall roughly within that range for maximum results. Now, if we're talking about the science behind it, the science-based community tends to agree that when volume is equated for the week, the frequency doesn't really matter as much. Essentially, it doesn't even matter how many times per week you train that muscle, as long as the volume is the same, the results are very similar. I agree with that, but up until a certain point. Let's say you do 14 weekly sets per muscle group. You can do 7 sets per that muscle group on Monday, and then another 7 on Thursday. Based on the science, you'll get a similar benefit from just doing all 14 sets on Monday. But personally, I like 2 times per week. I feel that breaking up those 14 sets over multiple sessions throughout the week keeps the quality of work high. This way, you're doing half of that weekly work on Thursday when you come in fresh, rather than trying to cram it all into one single session. By breaking this up, you could train with heavier weights, you could lift with better technique, and over time, that will result in more muscle built over the long run. But again, 1 to 2 times per week is the range. That doesn't mean it has to be one or the other. It could be somewhere in between. Personally, I set up a lot of training plans that actually work on a rotating schedule. And with my current training, I'm actually hitting body parts once every 4 days currently, which is not exactly twice per week, but falls within that range. Right now, that actually works out to twice every 8 days. Bottom line, if you're anywhere between that 1 to 2 times per week frequency, you're in a good range. Now, my personal preference is if you have more than 10 weekly sets per muscle group, you should break that up into multiple sessions. But if you train with 10 sets per body part or less per week, you could actually fit that into one single session. Tip number 2. Focus on progressive overload for specific exercises. There's been a ton of debate on what is the primary driver of hypertrophy. Some will argue that it's total training volume, or simply just doing more sets. Others will say that it's not volume, it's intensity, and that the number of sets you do doesn't even matter. All that matters is training a muscle to failure. Others will say it's the pump, the list goes on. But the one method that you can never dispute is in fact progressive overload. Adding more weight to the bar, doing more reps with the same weight, performing the same weight and the same reps, but with better technique. Doing this over time builds muscle and strength, regardless of the pump, regardless of how many sets you're performing, or even how intense those sets are. Now, don't get me wrong. Training needs to be done at the appropriate volume and intensity for progression to occur. You can't just train easy and very infrequent and expect to grow. However, there's a range of volume and a range of intensity that you could train within in order for this to occur. And as long as you're training within that range and you're able to recover and you're still able to add more weight to the bar, you're still able to perform more reps, you're still able to progress in some way. If so, growth and adaptation is occurring. So now if you take one guy and you put him on low volume training, and you take another guy and you put him on high volume training, and after X amount of time, they both went from benching 225 pounds for 10 reps to now benching 315 pounds for 10 reps. A very similar level of muscle growth is going to occur. Now, the exact volume and training intensity that you should train with is going to actually come down more so to individual genetics and recovery ability here. But my point is, whatever the sets, reps, and intensity of your training plan, understand that it's not those numbers, but the progression that you're actually after. Tip number 3, all working sets should be performed to failure or near failure. Maximum muscle growth will occur when taking a set to momentary muscular failure, but similar results can be had by taking a set near failure. But now, if we're talking about sets taken 3, 4, 5, or more reps away from failure, these sets stimulate muscle growth so minimally that I don't even consider them working sets, but more so warm-up sets. And now, most guys will even argue if you should stop 1 rep shy of failure, saying that it's not a fully effective set. And I will say this, 1 rep shy of failure is still a very hard set. If you're doing heavy compound free weight movements, things like barbell squats, deadlifts, and overhead presses, 1 rep shy of failure is basically going to be the last clean rep you can perform. And in a real life practical standpoint, on a free weight compound movement, this is generally about as far as I'd recommend taking a set. There's only a higher risk of injury involved when you plan on taking a squat to the point that you actually fail a rep. Most people will never actually deadlift to the point that they fail to lock out the lift, especially during a normal training session. Now, when you take something like a machine, which is generally less systemically demanding and more stable, these can be a good tool to use to take a muscle to true muscular failure. And personally, I'd advise training like this. On free weight and heavy compound lifts, to maximize muscle growth, take each set within 1 rep shy of failure, or that last clean rep you can perform. On isolation movements or even machines, you can take a muscle to momentary muscular failure. Now, if you do this on all of your working sets, each one of these sets should maximize the effectiveness of muscle growth for each set. Tip number 4, train with moderate volumes. Going back to science, the general consensus is 10 to 20 weekly sets per muscle group is ideal for growth. And in my opinion, that does fall in line with most people. However, 10 to 20 sets is a huge range. 20 sets could be grossly overtraining for some individuals, and 10 sets could be extremely undertraining for others. The key, however, is matching your training volume with your training intensity. If you're sticking with my recommendations of taking each set near failure or to muscular failure, you're going to require way less sets than somebody who's just pumping up in the gym. But you're also not going to be able to perform as many hard sets. So your goal is to be able to perform as little amount of sets as possible to still create that muscle growth stimulus, and also train with no more sets than actually required for muscle growth, or you can run into overreaching issues. Now, to determine how many sets that is for you, we need to look at the most important part of training. Again, that's progression. To answer the most common question, how many sets should I do? Let's look at what drives progression. Let's say you're currently performing 5 weekly sets per muscle group. And as an example, let's say that you're not currently getting sore, but you're also not really progressing in the gym. If that's the case, you might want to bump things up. Now, let's say you're performing 20 weekly sets per muscle group. And in this example, let's say that you're always sore, and your performance is not only increasing, but you're actually regressing in the gym. If that's you, you're going to want to cut your volume down. You might find that if you're on either end of the spectrum, you might make great progress training in the middle, let's say 10 to 15 weekly sets. Now, there's no magical number like 12 weekly sets. Again, it's a range, 10 to 15. And if you can grow and recover within that range, anything below that is likely not enough stimulus for you. And anything above it is likely not enough recovery. Now again, this is just an example, and that range might not be ideal for you. It's going to be strictly based off your experience and recovery ability. But understand that there is a range and a sweet spot for everyone. And in addition, that range can vary per muscle group. Experiment with your training and find what that range is for you. Tip number 5. Train with sufficient rest periods. For some reason, a very common mistake that most guys make is training way too fast. They do a set, then they rest only 30 to 60 seconds, and they jump right into the next one. And if we're trying to build muscle, that's actually the last thing we want to be doing. Our goal is to increase performance, to lift heavier weights, to perform more reps, and to perform each set with solid technique. We can't do this if we're taking short rest periods between sets. If rest periods are too short, performance will go down set to set. And now, we're no longer performing sets with solid technique. If rest periods are too short, performance will go down set to set. And now, if we're no longer performing sets with solid technique, we're now severely limiting our ability for progressive overload. As a general rule of thumb, I rest no less than 2 to 3 minutes from big compound lifts. And for isolations, that's no less than 60 to 90 seconds. And to be real honest here, there's plenty of times where those big compound lifts take me at least 3 to 5 minutes to recover from in between each set. And as you become bigger and stronger, you might actually find that you need to increase your rest time between each set. A set of 500 pounds on a deadlift will wreck your body way more than a set of 135 pounds for 5 reps, even if both are your relative 5 rep maxes. There's one trend that you will notice if you look around at other lifters in the gym. The bigger, stronger, and more advanced guys are generally training a bit slower. They're taking longer rest periods, but they're not doing so because they're lazy or out of shape. It's because of how taxing each and every set is in the gym. Regardless, in order to perform our best at every set we do, sufficient rest periods are needed. Tip number 6, rest days are part of the plan. I love training. If I could go to the gym 7 days per week and make great progress, I would do it. But the fact is, we grow when we rest. When we're in the gym, we're actually getting worse. With every set we perform, we're breaking down muscle tissue. We're inducing fatigue with every rep we perform. By the end of a training session, we're already in a fatigued state, and it's only rest that gets us out of it. Now, to really illustrate just how much fatigue sets in one single session, the other day, I walked in the gym and started my workout with one set of incline barbell press. My first working set of the day, I did 225 pounds for 15 reps. I then went on to do the rest of my entire chest workout for the day. And before I left, I went back and I did one more set of incline presses with 225 pounds. At the end of the workout, I barely got 6 reps. And it was even harder than the 15 reps I did initially. I lost more than half my strength by the end of the workout. Now, if you're going in the gym and you're doing this 7 days per week, you're constantly inducing a state of fatigue, not only on your muscles, but also on your nervous system. Now, this is pretty basic stuff that most people already know. But one thing I really want to drill home with this tip is, rest days, they're not breaks from the gym. They're literally part of the plan. You go into the gym to break down muscle tissue. You get out of the gym and you rest to build it back up. So now when you're setting up a training plan, understand that you need to match the rest days with the amount of training you're doing. When most people set up a plan, they pick the workout days that they want to train, and if that leaves them with 1 or 2 rest days, they take them. But ideally, you want to insert those rest days into the program as needed. If you're training harder or training with more volume, you're going to need to program your rest days accordingly. Tip number 7, pick the right movements for your goal. I can't tell you how many guys in the gym are trying to accomplish one goal, but they're using exercises that are useful for something completely different. You see plenty of guys in the gym who want to be bodybuilders or want to build more muscle mass, but they're spending hours a week on doing exercises like sumo deadlifts. In addition, they're doing plenty of other exercises that don't suit their goals very well. Bodybuilding specific exercises should target a muscle specifically. They should take that muscle through a large range of motion, and they should also allow you to progressively overload on that movement long term. If you want to be a bodybuilder, train with bodybuilder exercises. If you want to be a powerlifter, train with movements that develop skill and technique for specific lifts. Tip number 8, train with 4 to 12 reps on most movements. This is a topic that's a bit more nuanced. The general consensus is sets performed with 5 reps all the way up to 30 reps all have a similar effect on muscle growth. But that's not exactly the best way to look at it from a real life perspective in my opinion. You want to train with the best rep range for a specific movement to get the most out of it. For example, no one, and I repeat, no one, is consistently performing 30 reps on a barbell squat to failure. When performing that kind of set, the reps will get very hard, but it's likely not your muscles approaching failure, but your cardiovascular system. Not to mention, try performing big compound lifts for 30 repetitions with heavy weights. Form and technique are likely to break down way before your muscles do, simply by how painful it is. Doing a set like this is slowly just making each rep less effective. Now, take that same compound lift, pick a heavier load, and train 4 to 8 reps to or near failure. Your muscles are generally going to fail first. Your technique is likely to be much more solid every rep. And as a result, you're racking up more effective reps, the ones that we want to focus on for muscle growth. This is generally why I like lower rep sets for bigger compound lifts. Now, for other exercises that are not so systemically demanding, let's say something like a lateral raise, performing higher rep sets of 10 to 15 or even 20 shouldn't cause much technique breakdown. It shouldn't cause any of the other muscle groups to fail first as well. And something like this is not systemically demanding by any means. Now, in that case, you can use some lighter weights and higher reps and train a muscle near failure. So the best rep range for muscle growth is more dependent on the actual exercise you're performing, more so than any other factor. But generally, the sweet spot is likely to be more closer to 5 to 15 reps for any exercise. But remember, pick the rep range appropriately for the movement. Tip number 9, deload once every 6 to 12 weeks. Deloading is a period of time, generally a week, but it could be longer or shorter, where you reduce your training either by lowering the volume or lowering the intensity. In many cases, even both. The goal here is to maintain your muscle mass, but to drop off any fatigue that was built up during training. If you're training hard and you're building muscle, you're going to be putting your body through a lot. You can't do this forever productively. At a certain point, fatigue will just catch up with you. And in order to keep progressing, you're going to need to drop it off. Now, the harder you're training, the more often you're going to need to do this. And if you feel like you could just keep training forever over time, you might want to ask yourself, are you actually making progress? Because this might actually be a sign that you're not training hard enough in the first place. To deload, there's personally 2 ways that I recommend. The first is to keep your training exactly the same. Do the same number of sets that you normally perform. Do the same amount of reps you normally perform, but reduce the weights you're using to 60 to 70% of normal weight. Let's say you bench press 225 pounds for 10 repetitions on a normal week of training. On a deload week, you're gonna do 155 pounds for 3 sets of 10 reps. This is an easy week of training, and that's the point, but it's enough work to maintain your muscle mass. This also gives you the benefit of training with lighter weights, especially when your joints are feeling a bit beat up. And if you're a strong lifter or a more advanced lifter, this is my preferred method of deloading. The other method, which is much more simple and also more suited for beginners and intermediates, is use the same number of sets. This time, keep the same weight you normally lift, but only perform half the number of reps for each set. Going back to that example, if you bench press 225 pounds for 3 sets of 10, with this deload option, you're going to perform 225 pounds for 3 sets of 5. Either option works, just use the one that's appropriate for your situation. If you're fatigued from the heavy weights, drop the load. If your training volume is beating you up, drop the reps. Finally, tip number 10. The best training programs are often the most simple and basic of them all. These programs might not look like much on paper, but a well thought out program, it's not gonna have a crazy number of drop sets, supersets, and other intensity techniques. It's not gonna have an elaborate set and rep protocol. It's likely to look very simple and basic, but generally, the progression is well thought out. The intensity is structured. The amount of sets and reps is catered towards the exercises chosen. The volume is adjusted based on the intensity and the frequency. And the exercise selection is centered around the muscles that need to be worked on. In a great program, long-term progression is built in as well. And when you do this correctly, you'll realize it's not all those fancy techniques that build muscle. It's the basic principles programmed in an effective manner and executed over and over again for long periods of time. That's what builds impressive physiques. And if you're looking to build mass, I highly recommend you implement these techniques into your training now. And if you want the exact programs that I recommend to build more muscle using proven old school bodybuilding methods, all my old school mass gain programs are down below. And as always, if you want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.